So Bit Crush Boogie is kind of the epic of the album in my mind, with a lot of different stuff happening and a lot of different parts happening all over the place.
Yeah, certainly probably the one that I spent the most time working on and has the most layers and a lot of stuff going on this one.
A lot of stuff to dig into. So that's what we're going to try and do.
Where do you start talking about this one? Because there's a ton of tracks going on there.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Where would be the best place to start with this?
Because, I remember when you sent me kind of the in-progress demo, it sounded really cool. It was just kind of like this 2-section thing. And then between the initial demo and the final project, it kind of became this like symphonic masterpiece, I thought.
Well, firstly, thank you.
Well,
and it's we use the word symphonic loosely around here.
Fair enough. But very
and perhaps masterpiece quite loosely, but
a heavily orchestrated endeavor, shall we say?
Well, as I recall, the basic idea was to kind of have this simple drum pattern that had, I think I had sketched out something on an 808 kind of sounding thing with some pitch to it. And that we went about kind of using that as an inspiration for the basic ED. Well, I guess we used the EDP to create it, but the sort of basic, we're just going to call it an Andre loop for the time being. And you can discuss what exactly this is comprised of in a moment, but this thing, So, to me, this was sort of the basis for the A section, having a sort of a funky little percussive loop that kind of had a major and minor aspect to it. It had a pitch component to it, despite being sort of what I've labeled drums,
Right.
Kind of alternating between that section, which eventually sort of gets fleshed out into essentially like kind of like a shuffle. Here it is when it comes back. I've got these labeled, intro, 2 sections of intro, A sections, 2 A sections, B.
What is FG?
FG, where is that?
Keys, FG parts.
Oh, okay. That's keys, foreground parts, keys, background.
Got it.
You know what? This did end up being quite symphonic, so there may be a few tracks of keyboards.
There may be.
There might be a couple that got grouped into foreground and background. It's true. This was actually a big mixing endeavor for me, just to kind of strip down a lot of the stuff that we recorded as on the editing side and kind of figure out what really needed to be there and what didn't.
And it was all really good stuff that you tracked too. And I'm not saying that to be a polite collaborator. It's just when I heard some of the rough versions that you had tracked, like there was a lot of great stuff on there.
Well, and I think that's, I felt similarly that we had a lot of really cool parts. Now, even if we were to look at the EDP parts, now, one thing that I requested that you do was that you break up some of the percussive devices that you might normally use in a layered context live. You just layer one after the other and do your thing. I requested you do a lot of those separate so that I could, kind of pan them and, and so, as a result, the track count got high because instead of just having one track of, stereo drum track, we had, this is the sort of our drum set, from here to here. And then, actually, here are some additional effect tracks based on those, spring reverb to one of the snares.
Yeah, so like 14 individual tracks that made up.
Well, and then it seemed appropriate to have percussion. And when we got in there, there's a few tracks of these percussive parts too. So, track count got high. And, so there are a lot of subgroups here and groups. Also, I did use plugins. We did use some effects over here that are, some, room reverbs, slapback. These are plug-in versions of these. But a lot of the tracks also have things like this, which were hardware versions that I bounced out to be able to work with. So a certain number of these tracks are also just effects that maybe if we hadn't used hardware, our track count would be a lot lower, although we would maybe have some extra, bus, aux sends and that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
So the basic idea was, again, for this A section, this sort of drum-ish loop. Well, and I think, in my mind, I was thinking to kind of have all of the little things that you would create percussively be like its individual little part,
Right.
And I think for these A sections, I was sort of imagining a little bit of a one chord, like, if you were to jam out with Booker T and the MGs, I should also point out, this is not the only thing we have from the EDP here. So here's with the bounced out effects. But we do also have some layered texture. I mean, to me, this is almost like an organ pad or maybe pedal steel. Actually, it kind of sounds a little bit like that, but something that creates some harmonic pad wash content that also kind of has that major and minor, third, dominant, seventh character that is in the drums.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we were tracking this, you were specifically saying, let's get more of like the dominant seventh, let's get the major third and the minor third happening at the same time. So
yeah, and I think my thought on this is the sounds that you have are so great, and that if we took some time, I wanted to do one track. Well, this track, which kind of, I guess this is a theme throughout some of the larger songs on the record. Certainly Cranky Machines, the opening track, which kind of is sort of a tribute to New Orleans blues or something like that. I don't know if it was specifically, I can't say I conceived of it as a tribute piece, but I definitely thought, well, if I take some of the stuff I really like about that and then, put it in this kind of sound world that largely you're responsible for, and some of the kind of mixing approach that we took, I'd create something that I would really enjoy, that would be, unique, and I would dig. So with this, I think the kind of two reference points that come to mind are sort of Booker T and the MGs, for these A sections. One of the things I always loved about Booker T's music is he had that kind of soulful, earthy, gritty kind of thing that I love in a lot of blues and roots-oriented players. But because he worked on, well, I don't know if it's because, but I assume because he worked on so many great records, as a session player, I think his music is done pretty different than blues music for the most part. The MG's material tends to be very part oriented, and a lot of the I can't tell exactly how much improvising goes on those songs, because they're just like filled with these money hooks, and so that was kind of an approach I wanted to take for these sections, to have these little interplay melodies, even though we're kind of in a rootsy style, in a bluesy style, but have, very part-oriented writing rather than like blowing and improvising. So when that section comes back, you can kind of hear the full sort of climax of that, which to me is just sort of a shuffle, maybe a Texas shuffle might be a name that people use for this kind of groove. You could just hear that piano's just boogieing,
Yeah.
and there's an interplay between how all of the elements kind of come together. You know, and it's sort of a little bit compositional geeky in terms of how the motifs are interrelated and, you know, interrelated. And anyway, that's kind of the point of reference for me for the A sections. The B sections, you know, I always really liked Billy Preston's instrumental music. Now, his stuff is a little bit different, I would say. You know, obviously it's funky for the most part, and or at least, you know, he's sort of noted for being funky, and there's definitely some jamming happening in that music that's really cool and really fun. That I'm not sure, like I said, how much jamming is really happening on a lot of the Booker T stuff. It sounds like they kind of worked it out and they play it, and it's really scripted in that way. Whereas, anyway, Billy Preston, somewhat similar sound world, you know, organs, keyboards. Now he's a little bit later and a lot funkier in terms of the rhythmic approach. Not funky in the, you know, grease factor, but funky in like the style of music known as funk. And that's kind of what these B sections, you know, he comes later too, a lot of synth in his music in addition to piano and clavinet and organ.
What is the connection between Billy Preston and George Clinton?
I don't know. Do you know of one?
No, but I do know that, you know, like this stuff screams Parliament Funkadelic to me.
Well, I mean, you know, George Clinton certainly had Bernie Worrell, who was a great keyboard player who was super funky.
Right.
And this, you know, I mean, like I said, I wasn't trying to copy anybody's style in particular. That was just a point of reference in my mind as for example, as I was drawing up different sounds on the Juno. You know, these all kind of sounded to me like things that, not exactly, you know, I mean, you can hear at the end there, it gets a little harmonically weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just curious if like Billy Preston stuff was an influence on George Clinton and or Bernie Worrell or those guys, just because.
I don't really know. It's certainly similar era of making that type of music, I guess. I'm not sure. And so those were kind of the two reference points. And what I liked about it is the A sections were kind of like a shuffle, bluesy shuffle on one chord. And then the B sections, even though there is some harmonic motion, I was kind of thinking about it as a funk jam on one chord. Now, you know, they're in different keys. You know, and such, you know, and in the opening statement here, you know, it is a keyboard bass, and it is an EDP drum, but it kind of sounds like a Stax kind of band to me, you know? I mean, we move here, and it's, and even though the organ is on the Juno, and it's not, you know, like a Hammond transistor style organ, it's a synth. I think it's a very cool sound. When we move here to the B section, we're clearly in, you know, down here with our Juno orchestra of, you know, Juno cellos and all the kind of stuff, you know, maybe that would be at home in Billy Preston or Stevie Wonder from the 70s. And, you know, we move back here to the A section again. And the melody is now being played on a decidedly not very Stax, Memphis-sounding synth. You know, it's like it's you know. So there's some evolution in how the sections interplay. And so I mean that was kind of the basis for it. I was just trying to make something and write something that would be sort of simple in the premise. You know, drum groove based. You know, Stax style kind of A sections and then kind of a funkier B section.
Right.
And that's kind of the genesis, you know. And this says Ultra Beat here. I believe this is probably, this just looks like we did a little bit of sound reinforcement on your parts, on your kick. So at the end, I think I wanted it to hit a little harder. So this would be probably the only sample on this entire track. Would have been a little sampled kick drum to reinforce your drum part.
Just to kind of beef it up towards the end.
Just to give it a little more low-end information as we move towards this sort of the bigger climax that's, you know.
Yeah. I'm curious, could you mute the bass drum, the ultra beat bass drums, just so we can kind of hear the difference with it both in and out of the track?
Yeah, let's should we just get the drums up?
Sure.
So here we go. And we've got some drums without.
It's a subtle thing, but it definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, it's just a little bit lower and thumpier than the EDP.
Yeah.
And with the percussion. Percussion's fun to me because it has a decidedly, some of it more or less guitaristic sound to it, you know?
Yeah.
Alright, now that's something that definitely kind of feels very George Clinton, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Just having that kind of bass sound. And I guess this is what you would sound like if you were a member of a funk band playing rhythm guitar, if your EDP was tempo sync to your drummer.
Yeah.
Back to that dense section. There is one sample here, an omnisphere clavinet, which I believe I tried tracking. I think for the most part, a lot of this stuff I mocked up in synthland, you know, or MIDI land, I should say. Yeah. And then went about sort of tracking things and replacing things and creating, you know, maybe things that weren't exactly the same as what he had mocked up, but, you know, kind of used that to get the, you know, to quickly get the framework and then go about really trying to record it the best I could. And I think with the clavinet, that was an example where I didn't have ready access to a clavinet. I don't own one myself. And I do have some places that you could go to track one. But I think I tried a couple other sounds, and I just ended up being happy with the way that one sounded. And it's kind of... so that kept. That's stuck. That happened a couple times on our record. Rarely, you know. I mean, you can see we've got 100 tracks here, and there is one track of, you know, that clavinet that's sampled, and then there's that ultra beat drummer.
So we have two soft synth tracks.
Yeah, which, you know, honestly, I'm not opposed to software. It just, you know, the way we just, you know, maybe it was my decision. I'm not sure. But the way we decided to approach this project, that was not home base.
Right.
You know, home base was the outboard stuff, probably because you're using an outboard looper and you're using, you know, a guitar, and it made sense to kind of keep it there, you know.
It's my fault, basically.
Yeah, no. So, so that's what's going on there.
How long did it take you to record all those different parts?
I kind of slave on this stuff a little bit, partially for good reason, and a lot of times for bad reason. On a track that's this dense, I think getting the right sound is important, and we did mangle some tones in the mixing process for sure, but for the most part, I was thinking that if I had the right instrument in the right register with the right sort of chain of gear leading into the recording, that more or less the parts should speak in the way that they should. Or either get rid of it because it didn't work, or find a different instrument or a different register or a different timbre. And so I think I spent a lot of time on that aspect of it, especially with the Juno. So
arranging in a really traditional sense.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, sort of arranging as recording at the same time. I mean, a lot of these parts were to a degree mocked up, and then it got out the real Juno 60. And when you hear the actual sound you're dialing in, sometimes the part has to change, or in the process of, I like to, I guess on this music, when sketching it out, I shouldn't say I like to, but I did kind of write things kind of quickly, because I knew once we started getting your sounds, for example, the whole context was going to change.
Yeah.
And it made sense to kind of get a sketch going quickly. And then once we started putting in, your stuff, like for example, this stuff to me that you played here, I mean, that's really exciting to me. It's really cool. It's really exciting. And if my original thought was, oh, well, he'll play a pad, and that's the pad that you came up with, well, there's a lot to listen to there that doesn't necessarily require as much other parts to sustain my interest, because there's so much interest in that, which is hard to anticipate till you start recording your parts. So, and that would be the same with a lot of these, particularly the keyboard parts for me. I did have things mocked up, and then, as I spent a lot of time actually, I had things mocked up in a sort of sketched way.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I start really tracking it, I end up spending a lot more time just understanding the music and the intricacies of how different parts are related. And I really, that was fun for me on this track, was trying to sculpt all of the different parts to what was there. What the other parts were doing, which sometimes in the sketch wasn't exactly happening, sort of call, response, but, I guess I would say, the most basic example, if you were to listen to the drums, it's, just check out how the drums kind of complement the melody in certain ways. The snare hit. Yeah, and that's obvious stuff that, like, if you were playing this song with a band, probably would have naturally happened if you played it once or twice and people became familiar. Mm-hmm. But I'm positive when I sketched it out, I just had the same drum beat happening there, and then it just started kind of getting into it. You start contouring the different parts to each other. So I don't know. Right. I really took a long time, and, the piano solo, there's a piano solo at the end of this that, it's tricky. It was tricky to find a sound and a way to build it. This was a big challenge for me to build it to, the climax that I thought the piece needed, against such a dense texture.
Yeah.
And have it cut in a certain way. So, I think that was the kind of thing that would take a while. Like, for example, this piano, I'm kind of starting this in the middle. Well, as things start getting layered, sort of trying to ratchet up in intensity.
Mm-hmm.
Here this organ takes over there. And then there's this other guy that kind of comes in to finish it off.
Piano explosion.
Piano explosion. Yeah, right. So those were some of the things that probably take me the longest. When I couldn't do a couple takes of the piano solo, it's like, it's not getting, I think the original intent was just take piano to the end, just have that solo take us to the top. But I couldn't, maybe the limitations of my playing, I don't know, maybe the sound that I was getting. I was very happy with the way that piano sounded, but I couldn't quite get it to take me over the top energetically. So, kind of figuring out what some other parts that could come in and maybe take over. The organ obviously has this gritty sort of tone, and it's sustained and it's higher, and and same with the the explosion. There looks like another Omnisphere organ patch. That would be.
You're going to be docked some authenticity points for that, Ross.
That was just a sound that I ended up being happy with.
Sure. Right.
So I'd say it's hard for me to know exactly how long it took me, but those are the kinds of things that would take a while, And this wasn't a project that was meant to be anything than a lot of fun and to explore it to our full artistic satisfaction. So sometimes I would just go down rabbit holes for, just see where they would go, know. And that was, So I was very decadent with the way I spent time on this project, as you know.
I think it's good to give ourselves permission to do that.
I think so.
To chase down directions and accept that maybe it's not going to necessarily lead where we want it to or anywhere useful, but there's a lot of value in giving it a shot anyway.
Well, I mean, that's partially what I like about projects like this. I spend a certain amount of time working on commercial projects or things, where there's tight deadlines and I kind of need to stick with things I know I can get a result out of.
Yeah.
Which is effective and efficient. But in terms of getting into some new ground and learning things, I think projects like this are really helpful for me. Now, as I recall, you don't actually play, like the closest you play to guitar on this is probably EDP B. Maybe you could talk for a second about what goes into creating this. Now, I know we tempo sync this.
Yeah.
Now, when you have a track, maybe it wasn't as dense as this was when we were doing your parts, but it had a lot going on. What were the things that you were thinking about in terms of creating, this in the context of that?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, that, the part you were just soloing there, that's kind of my default setting if I start playing.
Okay, right.
If I just start trying to set up some kind of groove, that's kind of my wheelhouse. That's kind of where I start sounding, and especially if it's just over one note or a single chord. That's just the kind of stuff I do without thinking about it at this point. And it's a combination of percussive hits, and some of it is doing artificial harmonics with the right hand.
Right.
Some of it is doing selective punching in with replace function. And it's a little hard to talk about because, like certain things we do enough of, it just becomes so second nature that we don't necessarily consciously think about doing it. It just kind of comes out when we play.
So this is sort of your equivalent of like a blues piano player sitting down and playing a boogie woogie left hand or something for a funky context.
Yeah.
But what would be interesting? So this song, despite being, at this point in its evolution, a one chord funk jam to a degree. I mean, that's a very simplistic way to describe it. It'd be interesting to hear how that kind of approach you have going, which does not, I think one of the things that you did a really good job of here is creating the rhythm, the rhythmic element without stepping on some of the harmonic complexities that are going on, because that's a big challenge on a piece like this where on one level it sounds kind of like a one chord funk jam. But when you really listen to what's going on here, and I'm just going to get rid of our foreground keyboards and listen. It's actually not one chord at all. It's a lot more like If You Want Me to Stay or something like that by Sly Stone, except even more complex.
Yeah.
But I think by having
it's great.
Such a percussive approach to the EDP on this one, it lets you kind of create your EDP texture with pitch and kind of sound a little bit like a funk guitar without interfering with the harmony, because if you were just playing a D minor chord against that, it wouldn't work,
Yeah, I guess that's a good point, I guess. And a lot of the harmonic stuff was kind of designed to fill up space. A lot of the reason I gravitated towards the right-hand artificial harmonic stuff was to kind of get sounds that didn't have a ton of weight to them.
Right.
Because I actually found that if I play regular notes with the replace technique, it gets this very kind of hectic, nervous sound, which is not necessarily bad in and of itself, but it's very kind of like, rah, in your face. Whereas with the harmonic stuff, I find that there's still a lot of information and a lot of stuff happening texturally, but it's not as relentless and assaultive.
Right, and with these kind of harmonies too, by staying higher like that, you're up into the upper partials of the chords, the extensions, where a lot of times that kind of pedal note will work fine against what is in the lower parts of the chord, pretty elaborate, voice leading happening,
Right.
One other thing that might be fun to point out.
Sure.
Is, so the piece sort of starts with an echoplex and arpeggiation gesture.
Yeah.
So, what I like about that, so it does sort of recur in certain places.
Mm-hmm.
The reintro again. One thing that's fun is that it's a groovy tune, but it's nice to have some stuff that's like just slowing down or speeding up. And it also just kind of I liked one of the challenges for me on this project was finding sounds that I thought could blend into the echoplex world. And there's a certain thing to do. I'm not sure if it's when you're recording at half speed and then you speed it up, but if you listen to the character of for example, there's these. It's a very pointillistic. A lot of your sounds are very small, like you were just discussing. Mm-hmm. There are these high harmonics. Then you record this. I think on this track you recorded everything super dry.
Yeah.
Totally dry, actually. 100% dry. So everything's just like little pinpoints. And then with the way you cut things hard, often with the replace functions and the different parts of the, your technique with the echoplex, I felt that the arpeggiation kind of thing was just a fun thing to play with that kind of had that similar pointillistic thing,
Yeah, okay.
That's just an aside. I just started messing with it, but I would have never really. I kind of wondered later. I was like, why does that sound work? And I'm not sure exactly, but it just seems to work a little bit with that sound world,
So was that just you holding chords on a Juno and then manually adjusting the tempo?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
dude, that's a lot of stuff.
That is a lot of stuff.